Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Laneceya Russ, and I'm the Executive Director of March for Moms. I want to welcome you to our inaugural Enhancing Community Resilience to Improve Maternal Health workshop. As most of you may not know, I was born and reside in southern Louisiana and was mildly impacted by Hurricane Ida. In the aftermath of the storm, I was able to see maternal health organizations such as Birthmark Doula Collective, who we have with us today, spring to action to provide resources to pregnant and postpartum people and their families. With natural disasters and climate related events happening more frequently, we thought this would be the perfect opportunity to highlight and share the work of some of these amazing organizations that responded to the needs of pregnant and postpartum people in the aftermath of the 2021 winter storm in Texas, wildfires on the West Coast, and exposure to toxic substances. Because we know Zoom fatigue is real, we have some built in breaks throughout the workshop. We have DJ Frankie J spinning some tunes during a 30-minute break in the program. Please feel free to eat if you are able to snag a snack box during early bird registration, take a breather, or do a little two step wherever you are. We also have a networking session that you can check out during breaks throughout the workshop. We will also have a quick 15-minute break where you can attend a mindfulness and chair yoga session led by Jackie Fusha of Oshi Healthy. You can find both of these events happening here on the main stage. I also want to thank our sponsors, Sage Therapeutics and the Jewish Healthcare Foundation, for their continued support for March for Moms and this event. Now I would like to introduce our phenomenal keynote speaker, Kelly Davis, MPA. Kelly is the Chief of Birth Equity Innovation at the National Birth Equity Collaborative, which creates solutions to optimize Black maternal and infant health. Prior to NBEC, Ms. Davis spearheaded innovative initiatives for the NYC Health Department. During her tenure at the NYC Health Department, Ms. Davis led healthy eating and active living initiatives and served as one of the co-founding members of the Center for Health Equity, where she conceptualized the family wellness suites, community respite, and healing spaces for parents and children. Ms. Davis also spearheaded planning, implementation, and oversight of several special initiatives, including the city's first HIV public awareness campaign, totally focused on women, and a maternal morbidity and mortality initiative supporting 14 maternity hospitals in a long-term institutional transformation process that addresses structural racism, bias, resilience, and trauma-informed care. Ms. Davis holds a Bachelor of Arts degree from Princeton University, where her senior thesis explained how women of color experienced contraception in the 20th century, and a Master of Public Administration degree from New York University's Wagner Graduate School of Public Service. She is also the co-founder and chief equity officer of Kinship, a consultant firm that supports healthcare and public health transformation through evidence-based practices rooted in principles of trauma and resilience-informed care and anti-racism. Please welcome Kelly to the main stage.
Wow. Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon, wherever you are. My name is Kelly Davis. Thank you so much, Laneceya. And it's really a pleasure to be here with you all today. In the course of my work at the National Birth Equity Collaborative and over the course of my career in public health that spans nearly 15 years, I have never once seen an event totally dedicated to pregnant and parenting families and the climate crisis. So automatically, I feel really encouraged, and I look forward to sharing my remarks with you today. Okay. So today we're going to talk a little bit about mothering Mother Earth, the climate crisis and birth outcomes. You can follow along with us at the National Birth Equity Collaborative at Birth Equity, where we can be found on Twitter and Instagram. And if you want to hear about Black reproductive justice advocates' thoughts yelling into the abyss, you can always follow me at Kel Duro. So a little bit about our journey today. I'm going to talk about how I came to this work around climate and reproductive justice. talk a little bit about the science between the climate crisis and the Black maternal health crisis, which are actually inextricably linked. And then talk a little bit about how today, this week, has given us new opportunities on the federal and international stage to really support the needs of pregnant and postpartum folks when it comes to environmental degradation and climate change. And then hopefully together we can have a pathway forward. So I'm Southern. Okay, that's a disclaimer, which means I'm going to talk a lot. My subjects might not always agree with my verbs. And I'm hoping that we can have a conversation, even though Zoom fatigue is real. This is a new platform for me. So if you have comments, if things are resonating with you, if you have questions, feel free to place it in the comment section, and it will be streamed by Laneceya and some of our wonderful folks that are working behind the scenes to really make today's all-day workshop a success. Normally in keynotes, when I say, what makes a good keynote? I often hear like, we're supposed to inspire folks and support them in changing the world. And I think hopefully maybe my remarks will do that. But actually, more so than inspiring you, I hope that I enrage you. I hope that you leave here bothered by some of the things that you will learn around what climate change and environmental degradation, the climate crisis means, particularly for women of color and birthing people. Why? Because I think all social justice movements are undergirded by anger, right? The Stonewall riot didn't start by peaceful protests. Anger for what corporations or our government, how they are neglecting us, how they are erasing us, how they are minimizing us, is healthy for social change. So when you're just inspired, the next day you go back to doing business as usual. I hope today something gets you on fire enough to want to change and do something differently, because if you're on this call, you're already in a position of privilege. If you're working in a community-based organization, that means we have access to the community, right? We're often the halfway point between the larger harmful institutions and the folks that are really on the ground. And so I'm hoping that some of the things I'm going to say that we're going to discuss together today move you, make you so angry that you look inside, reflect on you and your leadership, and figure out something that you can do differently to really protect the women, birthing people, and children in your community and in your orbit. So all the time I get asked, what does the climate crisis have to do with the Black sexual and reproductive health crisis or the Black maternal health crisis, as if they're totally separate. And we're going to go through the science, but the science actually isn't the best demonstrator for what is the link between the climate crisis and the Black maternal health crisis. The truth is, I can tell this story best by my body, by my lineage, by my legacy, because the personal is political. And my story, my being on this planet, is really a story of land resistance, environmental degradation, and resilience, along with the age-old legacy of Black women protecting each other during childbirth and after. So on the left, I have here my grandmother, Charlesette Robinson, who was born in the 1930s in South Carolina, and along with the Great Migration moved to Baltimore for a better life, where she had my mom, who was also born into segregation in the 1950s. So my family lineage is actually one of many legacies of birth workers. Each oldest daughter winds up being a birth worker. My mom, as you see here on the right, my mom, that's me, in the premier fashions for childhood Southerners. In the year 1992, the year my sister was born, that's her with a little band on her head, Christy, my brother and my mother, my nuclear family, 100% of which reside in the state of Mississippi. So my mother was a neonatal nurse, my grandmother was a neonatal nurse, and her mother, who was born in the teens at the turn of the century, in the South was also a neonatal nurse. So we have a long history of protecting Black women, pregnant people, and our children. But when it comes to environmental protection, I also have a part of my family that is really steeped in that. My grandfather, who tragically passed the month and year that I was born, his name is Jasper Davis, and he worked for the Department of Agriculture in the state of Mississippi, where all of my family still resides. He processed loans to farmers and handled farm subsidies. And even though he had 2 masters in public health and agriculture, he had to travel all the way to Michigan to receive his master's because the University of Mississippi was not open to Black folks at the time. And so really understanding the link between maternal child health and environmental protection is one that I have by blood. All of it courses within me, and we'll talk about the science that links them, but nothing links them more than my body, my physical presence here on the face of the earth. So a little bit about the state of Mississippi. Laneceya is from Louisiana. Before this presentation started, we got a chance to kind of kiki. Golf girls are always finding ways to make connections. But my story, racism is a story of place. And so we talk a lot about redlining, but we also don't talk about environmental degradation when it comes to how racism plays out across several different parts of the environment to restrict opportunities, including access to health and well-being for Black and Native people. So Mississippi is the French interpretation of a Native word that describes the longest waterway in all of the United States, the Mississippi River. And it's the nation's poorest state and Blackest state. And those 2 facts are obviously inextricably linked. Still today, you see rows and miles of cotton fields from farmers and from whole entire economic systems that really only procured their wealth through the enslavement of Africans, of which I am a descendant. So each day, when I think about my upbringing and how I came to this work, I think about my grandfather, obviously. I think about my mom and my grandmother and my great-grandmother. But the truth is, I think about my own life more than anything. Here is the Ross Barnett Reservoir that I crossed every day to get to school, every day to get to church, every day to visit my mom when I go home for the holidays. Prior to the COVID pandemic, I crossed this every time. And when I was very young, I was told who our waterway was named after. The Ross Barnett Reservoir, for a little bit of context, is where all of our drinking water comes from. It's over 33,000 acres of a reservoir connecting the Pearl River. So all of the state's drinking water comes from the Ross Barnett Reservoir, and that's managed by the Pearl River Valley Water Supply District. And how did it get its name? So on the left, this gentleman here that you see waving the Confederate flag is Ross Barnett. He was the governor of Mississippi from 1960 to 1964. And he was what's called a Dixiecrat, meaning a Southern Democrat whose major policy position, the Dixiecrats were famous for their adherence to the idea that racial segregation was their key policy proposal. Ross Barnett's claim to fame is that in 1962, despite a federal order, despite Robert Kennedy's order at the Justice Department, failed to allow Black men to register at the University of Mississippi. So when I talk about my grandfather, who white farmers depended upon for his expertise in agriculture, having to go outside of the state to procure his education, but still being barred from being a supervisor, even though he had experience eclipsing that of his white peers is really connected to the fact that Ross Barnett would not allow Black folks to actually get education at universities across the state. And even in the 80s, in the 90s, today, this reservoir is named after him. So between 1964 to 2021, still today, the drinking water, the recreational water that Black and Indigenous people across this country have to interact with is marred by racism, even in name, right? Even in name, we're saying that the drinking water is not a right, right, for all of us. So my understanding, coming from my upbringing in Mississippi and Maryland and Baltimore, is that everything is environmental health. And that has been a thread over the entirety of my career. I started my career at the New York City Department of Health and Mental Hygiene, the largest health department in the entire world for the nation's largest metropolis, collating death certificates for the Centers for Disease Control for hyperthermia and hypothermia deaths, meaning folks that died because they were too hot and too cold. And there I saw a key correlation between who society has forgotten. So many folks were homeless, but also there were women and children who died because they were in heat waves, living in public housing, were disabled on the 20th floor of a building, and an elevator that they couldn't access because it had been defunct for over a year. And so they died of being too hot. So I learned very clearly on that environmental health and the climate crisis impacts almost every aspect of health. Here I am on the left-hand side when I still have my lovely dreadlocks with New York City soon-to-be mayor starting in January, Eric Adams, who was formerly our borough president, only the second Black person to ever be mayor in New York City's history, talking about food justice in East New York, Brooklyn, which is the neighborhood that has the smallest proportion of square footage per person, and some of the nation's dirtiest supermarkets, certainly the dirtiest supermarkets, according to New York Agriculture and Markets. So understanding the link between communities that have high rates of severe maternal morbidity and mortality, who don't have access to affordable food, who also die because they're too hot or too cold, or don't even have access to quality care, dealing with environmental hazards such as asthma. Also, this work continues at the National Birth Equity Collaborative, where we continue in my role as a chief of birth equity innovation to really expand the conversation outside of health being what happens inside of a doctor's office, because we know that health, only a small fraction of your health is determined by what happens in clinical care, but really the context of the life that you have, where you live, where you work, your environment, right? So environmental health is literally everything. However, we often let it fall through the cracks. So I often find myself asking, if we all talk about Mother Earth, how are pregnant people and postpartum individuals consistently left out of conversations related to environmental degradation, the climate crisis, and climate change? I've learned that I don't think that we do mean it, because if we did, if we really meant what we said when we said Mother Earth, meaning the potential to give life, to sustain further generations, we would really shift our federal policies, right? How can we say that we're protecting Mother Earth as climate advocates when we don't even have federal policies that allow across every state in this nation pregnant people, pregnant women, to take breaks at work, to drink water when we know that water, we all need water. Every human being needs water, but pregnant people need more water because they're creating blood volume for the baby, right? And yet we do not even have a federal legislation that allows folks equal access to use the bathroom, to express breast milk, to drink water, to rest, when we know that pregnancy is can be a stressful condition, particularly for those of us that are marginalized by racism, xenophobia, sexism, and other spheres of oppression. The Pregnancy Fairness Act still has yet to be passed, right? So in 2021, even though we have a large proportion of our country that says that they are pro-life, right? We can't even manage to protect folks that are in the elements working and allow them the environments they need to succeed. So I've come to the conclusion is that when we say Mother Earth, we actually really don't mean it. And I have to say, why? Why are we consistently neglected when it comes to climate change advocacy, climate change research, climate change resources? And I think it starts at the top. When you ask anyone in the United States, who is the most meaningful climate activist? Most of the time I hear one of these three folks, right? We hear about Al Gore, who for 20 years has been talking about climate change. Was really one of the first folks with a national profile inside of our government to really think through and make the case for needing to intervene around carbon emissions, closing the hole in the ozone, and larger climate advocacy. Right now, there's a lot of buzz around John Kerry, who is a special envoy for the first time to the White House and the Biden administration. And then, of course, Greta Thunberg, who is a lovely young climate activist who has really this week been making the headlines for protesting what's happening at the UN Climate Change Summit. And while I'm very grateful for the contribution of all of these individuals here, I have to say, when I've been looking at the footage of the last 10 days for the UN's Climate Change Summit, I can tell why we're not talking about mothering, why we're not talking about pregnancy, because people who are capable of pregnancy, women of color, trans folks were scant to be seen, even in the crowd, even at the podium. And for the first time, there was a gender day, which I believe was yesterday or the day before. But make no mistake, a gender day is not a substitute for a gender strategy, right? And unless we really have folks that are the most marginalized, including our Native and Indigenous cisgen leading climate change, our Black and Afro-Indigenous folks leading climate change, actually, we're going to continue to see this schism where the needs of Black women and pregnant folks continue to fall through the cracks, because pregnancy was never on the agenda for Al Gore, never on the agenda for John Kerry. And to some degree, even the framing around climate change negates some of the concerns that women of color face throughout the nation. Certainly in the work I've done in New York City and in parts of the American South, when we talk about climate change, people are not really thinking about the ozone layer. Those lofty goals about carbon emissions do not reflect the emergencies that folks that are pregnant today are thinking about when they're asked about their environmental concerns. So what are some of the things that we think about? We think about trash, right? But those are things that are not talked about at the climate summit. Even if you're in New York City, or I'm sure the city where you reside across the country, you'll probably see a difference just in how much trash is on the ground. If you're in a Black neighborhood, if you're a Latinx or a Native neighborhood, or a white neighborhood. Certainly in New York City, when you're in Midtown Manhattan, the business improvement districts are there all day picking up trash. The sanitation department is always picking up trash. And yet when you're in Harlem or parts of the Bronx, there are like mountains of trash that have not been touched in decades, right? As a function of who lives there. Also, we talk a lot about transportation, smog, and emissions, right? So not really thinking just about corporations that pollute, but we can see what happens to Black neighborhoods that are displaced in New York City, across the nation, with highways. What happens to asthma? And we know that asthma, research has proven that asthma and other chronic conditions of the lungs really contribute to severe maternal morbidity and mortality. And those things will not be solved just by clinical interventions, right? We have to go back and thinking through, how do we decide where transportation is placed? There's a large history of displacement. Here now in New York City, there's an exhibit around the Black neighborhood called Seneca Village that was displaced, totally displaced, to create Central Park, where is a lot of white people reside. Some of the most expensive real estate in the country is overlooking Central Park. So oftentimes greenery is devoid or taken away from Black communities, which winds up with them being hotter, right? And exposure to heat and all the sequelae that results in the Black maternal health crisis, or contributes to Black maternal morbidity and mortality. And all of that honestly starts at the top. Even, I hate to say it, I can tell that the UN climate change, international and national conversation didn't involve Black or Native people, particularly those that have been colonized by Britain, because there's no way that any Black organizer would ever have a conference whose abbreviation is COP. So from the get-go, we can tell you that our concerns are really not taken into account. And you see that time and time again in the research and the advocacy that neglects the needs of Black folks, other people of color, women, and queer people. So this was yesterday in the New York Times. Women of color are leading the climate protests. I'm going to correct that heading. But who runs the global talks? Who runs the global talks? These folks, right? The folks that lead nation states, which are overwhelmingly not just who lead nation states, the folks that lead nation states in high income countries, in Western Europe, in America, take up the majority of time as speakers. Yet when we talk about who's on the ground leading the protest, it's women. It's women of color. And we're hoping that hopefully with the redistributing of power, redistributing of resources, we can get to an agenda that includes the needs of pregnant and parenting folks. But we won't be able to do that until we totally re-envision what climate advocacy looks like, and makes it more in line with the environmental justice movement, which was created by Black folks, which was created with Native folks and Indigenous folks, instead of the kind of top-down conference coalition toolkit without any kind of accountability structure that has really been defining our foreign policy and domestic policy for generations. So the science is clear. Environmental justice is a reproductive justice issue, right? Here, the National Birth Equity Collaborative was really pleased to join the Human Rights Watch, the Black Women's Health Imperative, the Latina Institute for Reproductive Justice, and a better balance to really categorize all of the research that talks about increasing temperatures, right, caused by the climate crisis, and what they do for and how they contribute to poor birth outcomes, specifically for Black women and other women of color. The social positioning of Black women exposes them to environmental toxins, right? And so how does that play out? How does structural racism in place play out, right? So I talk about my history in Mississippi, how even the names of waterways are restricted as a sign to tell you that even though water is a human right, we really don't think you should have access to it. We see that over and over and over again, resulting in extreme heat, lead exposure, and air pollution, right? I spend my days supporting women who have children who are exposed to lead, because they have slum landlords who have not painted their buildings, who do not repair the dust, right? The CDC often, just now in the last 2 weeks, lower its threshold for intervention for lead as a result of organizing of Black and brown women of color to really address lead exposure, even though there's no safe exposure for lead. We saw what happened in Flint, Michigan. We see what happens when folks are cutting corners in Black neighborhoods, in Black cities. We see what's happening inside of schools when we don't replace lead pipes, right? Inside of poor quality housing, including public housing, where lead paint from generations ago is used and dust is not cleaned up. All of those things contribute to developmental delays and stillbirths, as we're seeing in Flint, Michigan, as we've seen in Baltimore, in DC, over the course of generations. And yet we still don't have national standards, right, for what it means, for what housing is as a human right. Extreme heat has been linked to prematurity and low birth weight. And Black women are more than likely to live in hotter neighborhoods because of redlining. Our neighborhoods have been designed to have no access to green space, right? To have access more to pollution. Think about all the buses. If you're in a city, all the buses and cars that sit in Black neighborhoods that contribute to air pollution for folks that do not have the privilege of being in their own automobile, who have to sit and breathe in the air pollution and the exhaust pipe is at the same height as a child's face, right? All of these things contribute to severe maternal morbidity, prematurity, and low birth weight. Please check out that fact sheet, which really goes through all of the ways that women of color in agricultural fields, in retail, are really exposed to some of the environmental harms and toxins that we know contribute to the Black maternal and infant health crisis. And how did we get here? Oftentimes when I talk about health and housing, we have these kind of cute little infographics, like what the World Health Organization, this is one of the better ones, what they have to say about healthy housing. However, I think that these are inadequate, right? The idea that climate or environmental concerns stop outdoors is actually a myth of white supremacy, right? And I'll tell you why. We're gonna play the game of life. So I'm gonna pretend that my name is Kelly and that I'm a 35-year-old Black woman hoping to have her first baby, living in Harlem, New York. I know it's a stretch. It's my real life, but play along with me. So during COVID-19, let's say that I was a frontline worker. More Black women are known to be frontline workers than any other racial and gender grouping in society. According to the research, we were more often also to be laid off than anyone else during the COVID-19 pandemic. So let's say I've been laid off because of COVID. I'm taking care of my parents who I'm afraid of getting sick because COVID was ravaging our seniors. I'm pregnant myself. COVID was ravaging pregnant folks, and I'm taking care of my younger children, and I've been laid off. What happens to me? I start turning off what? My electricity, or I stop running my air conditioner, even if it's hot, because I don't have enough money to pay my bills. That, or my landlord, in a way to start an illegal eviction, starts turning off my utilities. So if I'm already on the 14th floor, where it's hotter during a heat wave, I'm spending more time outside because my house is not safe. I'm about to be evicted because I have lost my job. Or when I'm inside, I'm conserving the things that provide me with relief, right? And so what happens? I wind up in the ER with heat stress, which starts off a domino effect, which winds up with me having my baby earlier in the NICU, right? And here I am taking care of a premature baby that was born too small or too soon, while also trying to care for my parents and younger children, all because of environmental concerns. However, climate change activists will have us believe that really this is about carbon emissions in the hole in the ozone, as if the air inside of my house, if that air is awful, so is the air outside of my house, right? There's a false dichotomy between indoor and outdoor environments. If I'm dealing with rats outside, I'm probably dealing with roaches inside. If I'm dealing with pollution outside, I'm likely dealing with mold inside. And all of these things really contribute to each other, which wind up with poor birth outcomes, which is we've proven through science time and time and time and time again. Also, the truth is these graphics, the way we even talk about climate change or health and housing, is not indicative of the symbiotic relationship between people, plants, and animals, right? Oftentimes in the climate space, we hear a lot about conservation of plants and species, which I think is very important. But where is the same energy for the conservation of people? Where is the recognition that people, plants, and animals, particularly in communities of color, have traditionally, historically lived in harmony, not to the detriment of one or the other? And so when we only spend money and more research, more dollars is spent on conserving animals, you can even look at commercials and figure out how many commercials are dedicated to saving animals and plants as opposed to people, as if we're not in harmony together, as if the structural racism has not created a schism between Black and Indigenous folks owning land, growing our own food, and feeding ourselves in harmony in a symbiotic relationship. So even though we are getting more and more holistic in the way we think about environmental health, environmental degradation, I think we still have a far ways to go. By picturing structural racism, gender oppression, and how that impacts not only the air we breathe inside, but the air we breathe outside. Not only the water we have access to for recreation, but the water that's coming out of our faucets. Not only the land that we don't have access to for play and recreation and green space, but the land that has been denied to us through redlining and predatory loans. These things work in concert really to enact environmental damage and harm, which winds up in the wombs of women of color and pregnant people. We don't just fail to prevent climate catastrophes, right? We abandon the people once they occur. So much of what is happening at the UN climate conference this year, while there have been some promising commitments, the truth is those commitments, there's no accountability mechanism. And we see what happens when there's no accountability mechanisms. And we see what happens when we really have just nation states, as if the air that's over South Florida isn't the same air that's over the Dominican Republic and Haiti. One of the things that this year has stressed me out the most is the case for what has been happening at the border with the mass deportation of Haitian immigrants that were seeking asylum. Now, keep in mind, maternal infant mortality and morbidity follow climate disasters. We've seen that the research has proven from Hurricane Maria a few years ago in the island of Puerto Rico. There was not only a rash of stillbirths, prematurity and low birth weights, but also even childhood suicides of elementary and middle school children following a mass crisis. Not only did we see prematurity and low birth weight spike for women who are born and living in Puerto Rico, we saw it for Latin American New Yorkers who are experiencing the trauma, of what was happening to even those that were not from Puerto Rico, right? But the effects were most observed for Americans, Puerto Rican Americans living in New York City, who began to have a large spike in prematurity and low birth weight, the leading cause of preventable infant mortality because of the climate disaster. And I believe that we're going to see the same thing as a result of what's happening. Even though the truth is none of this is mentioned, right? The link between climate change, race, structural racism, colonialism, and displacement is not mentioned really when we talk about climate as a function of anti-Blackness and gender oppression. In the city of New York, where I reside, nobody is more likely to have a life-threatening complication of childbirth called severe maternal morbidity than Haitian immigrant women, Haitian immigrant moms. And yet, we have mass deportation, physical assaults, right? Denial of basic human rights for folks that are fleeing man-made climate disasters. Following what has been happening over the past months, even our work at the National Birth Equity Collaborative, we have tried to engage so many climate magazines, journals related to the link between emergency preparedness and the failures of emergency preparedness, structural racism, and birth outcomes. And no one has been willing to engage us, I think, as part of the indictment, because when this happened, there was no outrage. Absolutely no outrage from the climate community, even though all of this was happening as a result of a climate disaster. So it's not our job just to prevent holes in the ozone, just to prevent carbon emissions. It's also our job to, because these things are already happening, to care for the people who have been maimed as a result of our failure to act, which are disproportionately Black and Indigenous people, no matter where they are in the world. Emergency preparedness is rife with problems with racism and gender oppression. According to analysis of Human Rights Watch, which looked over 100 websites, emergency preparedness plans, toolkits from all of America's cities, pregnancy was only mentioned twice for over 104 documents. Conversely, pets were mentioned nearly 40 times. So I'm more than likely to be able to have a plan for my pet, my dog, Bernie, who you probably hear in the background, than for my own pregnancy. And I see that time and time again. I go visit folks, even here in my building, there's stickers that say for someone who is emergency preparedness worker or EMS or the fire department, it says like a dog lives in this apartment. But we don't even have that to say children live here, to say a pregnant person lives here, because emergency preparedness continues to allow women, pregnant folks, children to fall through the cracks. And we see that time and time again, particularly what's playing out at the Texas border. But despite all the facts that this is, soul crushing, I have to sometimes take a deep breath. Seeing the abuse of Black bodies over and over again can have a traumatizing impact, even though this is a part of my everyday work, because I experience it. I support through direct service people who experience it, and then we have to study it. I try to remain hopeful in that, we have a window of opportunity. Even though it feels small and inadequate, there's a window that's happening now that we haven't seen ever in the history of climate advocacy. Even the fact that the UN Climate Change Summit had a gender day, even though women and gender expansive people account for half of the folks on the planet, having a gender day is a vast improvement of where we've ever been before. And here in the United States, we have even larger windows of opportunity. I'm sure everybody's been talking about the Buildback Better Act as a way to provide resources to jurisdictions and everyday Americans by taxing some of the the folks that are super wealthy who have not paid their fair share of taxes. What I find most promising about the Build Better Act is the history of reproductive justice, Black women-led organizers who have continued to elevate legislation like the Momnibus through our representatives like Representative Lauren Underwood, who has really been the architect, along with reproductive justice advocates like the National Birth Equity Collaborative and our sister organizations at the Black Mamas Matter Alliance, to really put forth the Black Maternal Health Momnibus, which is a comprehensive suite of legislative bills that really deal with the root causes of the poor Black maternal and infant health. So part of the Buildback Better Act includes every eligible provision of the Momnibus Act. And see, this is the difference in representation. And when we talk about diversity, equity, inclusion, we often stop at diversity and diversify skin colors without really thinking about how actually to have anti-racism and anti-oppressive federal policies. So what happens when we go from having climate leadership that are old geriatric white men of privilege to having a Black woman clinician really fighting and leading the charge to make sure that at every aspect of landmark legislation that the needs of Black women and birthing people are being addressed, right? So as part of the Build Back Better legislation, along with the Black Maternal Health Momnibus, part of that suite is the Protecting Moms and Babies Against Climate Change Act. And so what does that act that is a part of the Build Back Better Act provide? What does that provision provide? It invests in community-based programs to identify climate change risks for pregnant and postpartum people. So really putting money and resources into the communities that are trusted. You're going to hear from birthmark doulas, from Laneceya has a wonderful, and March for Moms has a wonderful suite of speakers today. We're going to talk a little bit about how we've done direct service, how we've done mutual aid, how we've responded. Because when the federal government doesn't respond, the truth is that Black women have always shown up for each other. Black people and communities have always shown up for each other. And that's something we continue to do, even in the midst of oppressive systems, right? In my private time, we're providing support to Haitian moms that find themselves on the border. You know, folks are giving legal aid, all the things that we're doing behind the scenes to make sure that we got us. That's what the reproductive justice movement is built around. And so in the Protecting Moms and Babies Against Climate Change Act, not only do we provide money to the folks that are actually doing the work, but we limit some of the barriers, right? We talked about heat exposure and what that does to pregnant folks. What does it mean to have subsidies for utilities through this act? This act will also provide resources for air conditioners, right? For folks that do not have access to cooling, really thinking through and providing capacity to folks that are doing the state ground advocacy to make sure that at least on the state level, while our national policies are in disarray, that folks are really protected from the sequelae of climate change in the states that they reside. Because as Laneceya said earlier, you know, different regions have different concerns. For the first time in New York City, we saw spates of flooding, which actually killed folks, more people than were killed in Louisiana during recent flooding after Hurricane Ida, who lived in basement apartments, right? And we know that Latinx and indigenous New Yorkers have been organizing against basement apartments for the longest. And so through this kind of work, we will be providing resources through the Protecting Moms and Babies Against Climate Change Act for the people who are actually advancing the policies to save the lives of their core constituents that are marginalized the least. I'm also really impressed and encouraged by what the federal government has been doing in its plan to promote gender equity and mitigating and responding to climate change. We have our first gender equity and equality plan ever from the White House. Never thought I would see the word equity. Always thought I would see the word equality, and never thought we would really cross the borders between the climate change advocacy, which has been male, white, and cis for the majority of the climate change movement, and gender equity, really creating the bridge to understand that gender-based discrimination or access to abortion and other kind of services are needed. Sexual and reproductive health services are needed all the time, but particularly after a weather-related or man-made climate crisis, right? Displacement happens after a crisis. Because of COVID and after the crisis that we've had across the nation with climate disasters, intimate partner violence has been off the charts. In New York City, we have not been able to even mount an adequate response to all of the calls that around intimate partner violence and domestic violence that have been coming through as a result of people being under stay-at-home orders, not being able to be outside, being laid off. You know, when we're talking a lot about Black women, about Native women, about Latinx women who are at home in perilous conditions, unable to move, and in stressful situations that were precipitated by economic hardship, by the COVID-19 pandemic, that results in Black women disproportionately losing their lives. And recently, in this month's Green Journal, the Journal of Obstetrics and Gynecology, we've seen an analysis performed by Dr. Maeve Wallace in Tulane, Kiara Cruz, and a whole host of other researchers, including myself, that there has been an uptick in even homicides, right, during pregnancy. And that data was for 2018 and 2019. I suspect that we're going to see even more gender-based discrimination, gender-based violence plaguing Black women, especially in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic and in the wake of these climate disasters. However, the fact that we have a federal government that's willing to bridge the gap provides me with some hope when sometimes I'm feeling a little hopeless. So, a pathway forward. If you're a part of this webinar, that means you actually have some privilege. You actually have some say in what policies and procedures are being put forth, how this can be different. I've seen some of the folks that have said they are registering. We have doulas on the line. We have midwives on the line. We have folks working in nature conservancies on the line. And we all have a role to play in addressing how pregnancy and postpartum periods are impacted by the climate crisis. Part of what grounds me in this work at the National Birth Equity Collaborative, where our mission is that we create transnational solutions that optimize Black maternal, infant, and sexual well-being, not just health. Health is really focused on disease and whether or not you die or whether or not you don't, but well-being. Well-being means the ability to play, to love, to earn, have a quality of life. It's the assurance of conditions of optimal birth for all people with the willingness to address racial and social inequities in a sustained effort. This birth equity was coined by our president and founder, Dr. Joy Perry. And the thing that provides me with my pathway forward, which grounds me every day as I do this work, is the sustained effort. The climate crisis didn't happen in a day. We cannot fix the holes in the ozone layer. We cannot fix the displaced Black neighborhoods. All of the environmental degradation cannot be fixed by a toolkit. It cannot be fixed with a statement on Earth Day. This requires a sustained effort. And that really is what birth equity means. And so what can you do? Or how can we create a different world together in a sustained effort? For me, that means supporting Black and Indigenous women and queer organizers. That means that the Indigenous water protectors, that their names and their organizations are known more than Greta Thunberg. That means that John Kerry supports Black women leaders inside of federal agencies, whether it's HHS or the EPA or the the White House Office on Environmental Justice, that committee, supporting their leadership and addressing what we think is important, because we have, not only do we know the lofty concerns, but we also have emergency concerns, and we have a history. We have a history of understanding how to live in harmony with animals, plants, and people that oftentimes the white Western world is devoid of, that capitalism is devoid of, right? That the folks that we have leading the world's largest governments do not prioritize. We've talked a lot about research today, but the truth is that there are actually a lot of research gaps, right? Most of the research around climate change is performed by academic institutions who are looking at particulate matter. Most of it is really focused on prematurity and low birth weight, which is an important infant health outcome, but so much less is devoted to actually maternal mortality, almost nothing. And even things like infertility. How does climate emergencies, how does environmental degradation impact my ability to get pregnant, impact my ability to have a pleasurable and fulfilling sexual and reproductive life? It shouldn't just be about babies. Part of the reason why we have a Black maternal health crisis is that we focused almost exclusively on babies. As Dr. Allison Stubbe says, the mom is the wrapper and the baby is the candy. And once you get out the candy, what do? You throw the wrapper in the trash. The research continues to throw the wrappers in the trash and the women in the trash, pregnant people in the trash. And that's indicative of who we have doing the research, right? We also have to rethink conservation. Why does conservation only apply to animals and plants? What does it mean to conserve a culture? What does it mean to conserve a neighborhood? Right? Species and propagating things and supporting zoos and animal sanctuaries is only one part of what we need to do in order to really save the planet. And we have to break this cycle of having a conference, right? Issuing commitments or statements, maybe if we're lucky, forming a coalition, but never making to course correction, right? So if you're part of this, I really urge you, and if you're a clinical provider, to think through the ways that heat sickness, exposure to cold, lead, all of that influences how folks are showing up. Housing, availability, affordability, access to green space, and the counseling that you are giving. Oftentimes the counseling that clinical care provides is not in alignment with folks' actual built environments, right? How can I exercise at the park if I'm afraid of community violence? Or, I mean, like myself, I used to run in the park, and my physician got on me for losing weight, but they didn't understand that me and my friends stopped running in the park during our Calcia 5K when 2 people overdosed, right? And there was a flurry of police activity. So not understanding the context of my built environment really doesn't allow folks to live their best lives in homes, in communities, or in clinical settings. And then also, please join me in holding philanthropy and governments accountable for how they spend money, who they promote, what they fund, including policies that disturbingly link climate change to overpopulation. The links to climate change or overconsumption cannot be found in the wombs of Black and Brown women. IUDs are not an evidence-based strategy for poverty or environmental degradation. We really have to get to the root of why our built environments look different and why they harm Black and Brown birthing people across the world, which really includes addressing the root causes of structural racism, gender oppression, colonialism, and poverty. If you want to learn more about what the National Birth Equity Collaborative is doing in the space around climate change and environmental racism, we would really love to hear from you. We are this field is still fomenting, right? And I've scratched on a little bit about what our research and our policy positions are, but we would love to work with any of you who are devoted to creating a better world, literally, for Black women, birthing people, and their kids. Thank you.
All righty. Kelly, I just want to thank you for being here with us today, sharing your knowledge and your wisdom with us on such a timely issue that's happening in our world. And I know I'm not only speaking for myself when I say we can listen to you speak on this all day, and we will catch up after this workshop. Thank you again for being here with us today. And I just want to let everyone know that our first breakout session will be starting shortly, and you can access it by clicking the sessions button located on the left side of your screen. So I'll see you all in the next session.